but I don't have a good answer to it. And I'm not going to lie and say that I do. But I do think that a good start is. So it's not usual that I would end up releasing something late on a Friday, but this has been a bit on my mind, and I'm trying to figure out exactly how to discuss this. What I have here is from February 2022. And it's the most recent one that is there for the Pew Research Center, which is nonpartisan. In its polling, and you can see from the title, Americans' trust in scientists, other groups declines. Republicans' confidence in medical scientists down sharply since early in the coronavirus outbreak. Now, the last poll for this is actually December of 2021. So, take that what you will. There's a little bit of time involved in here, but I have been thinking about this in light of, if you haven't noticed, online, the furious debate and debacle between, and the whole argumentation there that has gone on between Peter Hotez, if I have the name correctly, I believe I do. Hold on, just making sure. Yes, Peter Hotez, and we'll come to that article in a minute. Peter Hotez, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Joe Rogan, of which many, 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 many people have weighed in, and it seems to be somewhat viscerally in two camps. On the one hand is, of course, the camp of, yes, Hotez should have debated. On the other hand, of course, and you can guess from Holden Thorpe's thing there, that, you shouldn't debate. But I do think it is somewhat more nuanced than that, which is why I haven't said too much on it online, because I do think it is actually a fair bit more nuanced than you just should debate or you shouldn't with this, because I guess context of maybe what should be considered in that decision becomes important. But also, there was a note that came across in my radar with this, that there's a certain amount of blindness to ideological groupthink, or ideological not understanding ideological blind spots within academic circles, within scientific circles, medical circles, what have you. Basically, any of those things that somebody might dub elite. And that is something of a concern. And the reason I mention that in the context of this whole thing with RFK and Hotez is that traditionally, scientists writ large, medical scientists, doctors, and what have you, have enjoyed a position of having a great deal of trust from the American public, and having a great deal of trust and confidence also, I should say. And this is something that has traditionally carried across all demographic groups, all worldviews and perspectives. There is a very common thread in that has traditionally been the case. That is changing somewhat, and that is a concern. And that's because, think of all the good things that medical science, that science as a discipline has wrought, be it, the ability to go to the moon and back, new treatments for cancer, all of those kinds of good things that do make society better and do expand our ability and do make it possible to, I think I recently heard of a story of farming meat, of lab-grown meat, which frankly creepy, but that is a science thing, and I don't want lab-grown meat myself. I don't want to eat that. that's just the personal preference of me, and that's irrelevant to this. But think of it this way: that is a thing that has happened as a result of science. This is not to say that scientists are perfect. Far from it, because they are human. Um, but I do wonder, in what has happened, how much, in what has happened, I mean in the decline of trust, and I'll show you that in a second. In the decline of trust, how much of that is the result of the somewhat willful, well, maybe not even willful, but willful or even perhaps unconscious bias. I hate to use that phrase, but because I'm lacking of another good way to describe it. In other words, it may be there's plenty of data that shows that academia, where most scientists are, where most medical scientists are, is predominantly left of center leaning. I don't think there's too many that would dispute that. But does that mean that because you are so stuck in that bubble, that you fail to realize that the rest of the country is not like that? And you've so little exposure perhaps now to different perspectives and utterly different worldview that you don't recognize that there's a difference that makes, but that person is still human also, if they do have a difference. And as such, end up in a situation where it is very easy for you to think those folks who are not academics or don't share my perspective are not worthy of that commentary. Now, not worthy of reaching out to and working with. And the reason I mention this is, if you recall the Nature Human Behavior article a while back, which noted how nature's endorsement of President Biden did nothing of then candidate Biden in the 2020 election, did nothing to actually affect the election, but it did result in people viewing Nature, the publication, much more negatively, but also just scientists at large, where there was a tendency for folks to view that group of scientists much more negative, view scientists in general much more negatively. And I noticed that some of the commentary around that particularly was basically, well, that was primarily Republicans and we shouldn't care. We shouldn't care. They're lost anyway. They're not going to listen to us. Which is somewhat, to me, that's emblematic of a blind spot, in that you don't think that some people might share your opinions on things. You think they're too far gone. You think they're this, they're that, which is essentially an othering kind of thing. But if that is the attitude with which you are approaching a whole group of people, it would make sense to me if most of the disciplines seem to be in that direction and seem to be left-leaning, which you all know this watching, I am not very left-leaning. I'm more center to center-right myself. If that significant portion of a particular group of professionals is more left-leaning, and seems to have somewhat disdain for folks who are opposite from them, more right-leaning, would it not be possible that those groups would see that, or perceive that in some way, and therefore the trust in those people would decline? Moreover, is it not also possible that the most prominent of those in science, in medicine, and what have you, who go out there and take very, very left of center positions quite publicly and push for left of center policies quite publicly, is it also possible that they are perhaps viewed as representatives of the entire discipline, and therefore some people see that and say, okay, I'm not going to trust people from that discipline anymore. Why should I? They treat me like this, per this person over here who has been representing them, be it Hotez or Fauci or Holden Thorpe or others. And I'll show you in a second. Holden Thorpe is obviously not a big fan of RFK in his own commentary. But the reason I worry about something like this is, of course, the first thing is that scientific knowledge belongs to everybody. Communality. Whether you like it or not. We go after objective truth, and objective reality is there regardless of whether or not you agree with it, left or right. It does not bode well to have a significant portion of the population think that scientists are not interested in serving, in pursuing the truth, in having confidence that they have the best interests of the public in mind. So I do wonder how much of this is because of the attitudes, how much of this decline is because of the attitudes of scientists themselves and medical doctors themselves, and how much of this is because of communications. Because, remember, even though we're in an age of Twitter science, where scientists themselves can be very, very, very visible on social media, we still have a tremendous amount of filtration through news media. Most people do get just about everything they hear about from a scientific study, from scientists, from some kind of thing that involves science, through some form of news media. And take it for what you will, that most news media is not itself unbiased. As I'm sure Kieran, among others, would tell me with that. But this is the thing that I wonder about. So let us take a look real quick. Americans' confidence in groups and institutions has turned downward compared with just a year ago. So this is 2022 when this was published. 2021 was the most recent data. Trust in scientists and medical scientists, once seemingly buoyed by their central role in addressing the coronavirus outbreak, is now below pre-pandemic levels. Now, I want you to notice one thing. Yes, it's a decline. This is still a supermajority of Americans. Actually. Having a great deal or a fair amount of confidence. That is still a supermajority of Americans. Still a supermajority of Americans have trust in scientists. And this, of course, suggests to me something else. That yes, while things are going down, and I do wonder, hey, are we as scientists, having necessarily the best people out there to actually represent us in front of all people, not just the people we agree with? Or that perhaps most of these different disciplines agree with, but that's a whole other thing. But it does suggest a potential that there is some discernment there. That a lot of people will recognize that one individual nutcase among scientists does not necessarily shatter all. These two are quite in contrast to the others, and particularly if you go down here, this is elected officials, where there has been quite a steep decline in the confidence in elected officials in the United States. But partisan differences over trust in medical scientists continue to widen since the coronavirus outbreak. Democrats remain more likely than Republicans to express confidence in medical scientists and scientists to act in the public's best interest. So, this is the other one to bring a point on, and this is where I go back to, are you really sure you want to lose pretty much half the population? And admittedly, even in this case, it is still pretty much a supermajority of even Republicans or lean Republicans, which I don't think is necessarily the best categorization because of ideological range in either Democrat or Republican, right? But do you really think that's a good idea? To have a distinct amount go down and south. I do not necessarily think so. And I would encourage folks to consider carefully that we are individuals just as much as there are scientists. We are individuals at the same time. I don't think it's a good thing to see this kind of a decline and see a degradation of trust from one half but not the other. And of course, the reason I get worried about this is because science is there is no such thing as, left science or right science. There's just straight science at this point. That is always what it should be. Because there's things like this that will, of course, end up discouraging some younger generations from going into science and medical science. But also, when there is something important that happens, less likely to perhaps use the information when it is presented unbiasedly, less likely to use that information if you don't trust the scientists involved or you don't trust the source of that information. And that's fair enough, but that's why I mention this in light of the interesting kerfuffle over Peter Hotez and RFK Jr. No one, I don't think, is obligated to go ahead and do a debate. That's not the obligation. With respect to individual scientific circles, if you're in the middle, if you're publishing, you're peer reviewing, and you're going back and forth on that, and you have a comment back and forth, it is very good practice to do that debate, and often they will. So this is not to say scientists don't have their debates in the back. And that is the thing there. And this is not necessarily about Hotez and RFK entirely, because I'm just basing this whole thought train off of that whole thing because it's quite prominent. The real question is just in general. Holden here, of course, writes, scientists shouldn't debate gaslighters. And I don't think Holden goes on to write, Peter Hotez would to debate last week in Twitter and later mainstream media exploded with the controversy surrounding an invitation to prominent vaccine scientist Peter Hotez to debate anti-vax charlatan and spoiler presidential candidate on the podcast The Joe Rogan Experience. I can understand this is Holden's opinion. That doesn't help. Whoops, that's the Washington Post article. That doesn't help with this kind of thing. It doesn't help reverse that kind of trend. And I do think that in the context of discussing issues of science publicly, there should be a certain amount of cognizance of the fact that the amount of trust in medical scientists and scientists writ large is in something of a precarious place. Not very precarious, because obviously this is still, these are still high numbers, even amongst those where it's declined the most. But that's not to say it's a good idea to just randomly engage in ad hominems. Which, for one thing, I did listen to some of that, and I do think RFK is very wrong on many things. And on the other hand, I don't think Holden Thorpe and Hotez are quite right either. Yes, of course, you should be engaging in debates about science with scientists, even if publicly so. But the other thing that I noticed is that there's the debate over scientific research and theory, yes, and often that is not in the public purview. That is in journals, that is in commentary, in white papers and comment articles and what have you. That's not often in the public purview at all. But where it starts to cross that line and need to end up being in the public purview is as it relates to public policy. And I do think there's an argument to be found or to be made rather, that if you are going to be, as a scientist, using the knowledge you have to push for a particular policy, or particular policies, then you've opened yourself up in the realm of public debate about policy in which every citizen in a democracy is in part. And that doesn't mean everybody has equal expertise. That's not the point. But everybody has a right to take part, and a well-informed citizenry is the hallmark of democracy, or shall we say a republic, since that's what the United States is. So, as much as I can appreciate not wanting to get into this public kind of thing, I do think that when you cross into the realm of using said things to using said scientific knowledge to inform policy, then it does have to become part of a public debate. Whether or not you end up engaging that, no, you're not obligated to. But more importantly, I do think there's another perhaps argument to be made that it would have perhaps been helpful for this kind of thing in particular to turn around if it was considered, for some kinds of debates like that to happen, in reasonable manner. And, Holden is not wrong in what he said in the other article, that most scientists are not sharp, witty, snappy communicators. We want to talk about the caveats. We want to talk about all this and that. We do. He is not wrong about that. And most scientists are not the witty communicators that can just do one-line things, because that's not their training. Not their purview. There's a whole realm of science communication that's arisen in the last 10, 20 years in particular, that has come up to try and address that particular problem. And so many young scientists are getting that kind of training now to try and be able to be pithy, as it were. But that still doesn't address the trust problem, I don't think. Unless you are willing to have something of a respectful debate. Now, here's an example. I would not go through all of this to make this suggestion without leaving you a meaningful example. A couple of years ago, Bucknell University started their Open Discourse Coalition, and one of the very first debates they had was Jonathan Fisher and Shelby Steele, actually, arguing over the concept of systemic racism. That was actually a very meaningful, very good debate. And as much as I disagreed with Jonathan Fisher and agreed with Shelby Steele, you could see there was actually good argumentation and discussion. The other problem, unfortunately, is just general public, in that we've all hit the point, and I noticed this with the folks in the Hotez and RFK arguments right away. Everybody ran to their corners. And as I said, I think there is actually somewhat more nuance to the idea of whether or not scientists should get into public debates. And I've done my best to give you a bunch of my thoughts in the last 25 minutes, thereabouts. But I don't have a good answer to it. I'm not going to lie and say that I do. But I do think that a good start is having respectful debates between competing views of scientists or scholars on an issue, and have that available in public purview and put out prominently. And it may be, actually, that the Joe Rogan podcast would be a great place for that. It may not be. But I think that would be helpful. Not just for that, but also for the, how do I put this? Also for helping to reduce some of the polarization that there is in this country right now. I think it would actually be really, really helpful for that. Because I think we've all noticed that in the last few years. But I do think, just as a general closing thought, that the whole idea of whether or not scientists should debate in public is much more nuanced. And, to be entirely fair, no one is obligated to. No one is obligated to do public debates. If you're behind the scenes as a scientist, you are obligated to debate and defend your ideas as part of the process of science. But there's not a good answer to this, and I do think that for those who are comfortable doing something a little bit more public and debating, that it could actually be a helpful way to turn around some of the concerning trends that are seen here in the polls of the last few years. My long, kind of winded thoughts on a Friday, but let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door. Share the video, comment on the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrienne. May you stay curious, everybody.